Reading Lesson 106, Part 2. Find Part D at the beginning of today's story. Trials. Chapter 16 tells about Muff Potter's trial. The trial follows the same basic steps found in modern trials. A lawyer from the government will try to prove that Potter is guilty. The lawyer will present evidence and have a person who witnessed the crime tell what he saw. Potter's lawyer will try to prove that Potter is innocent. This lawyer will also present evidence and call witnesses. As the lawyers present their arguments, a judge will make sure the arguments follow the rules. The judge can tell the lawyers to stop asking questions that break the rules. So, what will the government lawyer try to prove? Answer: that Potter is guilty. Who will make sure the lawyers follow the rules? Answer: the judge. What might happen if a lawyer asks a question that breaks the rules? Answer: the judge will tell the lawyer to stop. Let's continue the reading. A jury will decide whether Muff Potter is guilty or innocent. The jury is made up of 12 people who listen to the arguments presented by the lawyers. Then the jury will leave the room to make a decision or verdict. All members of the jury must agree on the verdict. If the jury decides Muff Potter is innocent, he will be freed. If the jury decides he is guilty, he will probably be sentenced to death by hanging. Some questions before we start the reading. Who will decide whether Muff Potter is guilty or innocent? Answer: the jury. How many people are on the jury? Answer: 12. If the jury decides Potter is innocent, what will happen to him? Answer: he will go free. If the jury decides Potter is guilty, what will happen to him? He will be hung. So, before we start today's reading, I want you to keep these questions in mind. Why did Tom decide to tell his story? Before Tom told his story, why did it seem the jury would find Muff Potter guilty? On the last day of the trial, why didn't Muff Potter's lawyer ask the witnesses any questions? The story says Tom's days were days of splendor, but his nights were seasons of horror. Why do you think the writer used those words, the word seasons, to describe Tom's nights? How do you think Huck feels about Tom's decision? Explain your answer. So, let's begin today's reading. Chapter 16, Muff Potter's Rescue. Our focus question is, why did Tom decide to tell his story? Tom went home miserable, and his dreams at night were full of horrors. Muff Potter's trial began the next day. That day and the day after, Tom hung around the courtroom. He had a strong impulse to go in, but he forced himself to stay out. Huck was having the same experience. The two boys carefully avoided each other. Each wandered away from time to time, but the same dismal fascination always brought them back to the courtroom. Tom kept his ears open when people came out of the courtroom. He always heard distressing news. It seemed that the rope was closing more and more tightly around poor Potter's neck. At the end of the second day, the gossipers said that Outlaw Joe had told his story. The evidence he gave was firm and unshaken. There was not the slightest question as to the jury's verdict would be. Tom was out late that night on a mission so secret that he could hardly bear to think of it. He came to bed through the window. He was in a tremendous state of excitement, and it was hours before he got to sleep. The whole village flocked to the courthouse the next morning, for this was to be the great day, the day the jury would decide if Potter was to hang. After a long wait, the jury filed in and took their places. Shortly afterward, Potter, pale and haggard, timid and hopeless, was brought in, with chains on him. He was seated where all the curious eyes would stare at him. Outlaw Joe sat in the corner, grim as ever. There was another pause, and then the judge arrived, and the sheriff opened the court. The lawyers whispered to each other and gathered together their papers. Several witnesses testified about Potter's guilty behavior when he was brought to the scene of the murder. But Potter's lawyer did not ask these witnesses any questions. The attorney for the government now said, "The evidence shows that this awful crime was committed by Muff Potter. We rest our case here." A groan escaped from poor Potter. He put his face in his hands and rocked his body softly back and forth. Many people were moved, and some broke into tears. Potter's lawyer rose and said, "Call Thomas Sawyer." The audience was amazed by this statement. Every eye fastened itself upon Tom as he rose and took his place on the stand. The boy looked terribly scared. Muff Potter's lawyer said, "Thomas Sawyer, where were you on the 17th of June, about the hour of midnight?" Tom glanced at Outlaw Joe's iron face. The boy's tongue could not move. The audience listened breathlessly, but the words refused to come. After a few moments, however, Tom got a little of his strength back. In a soft voice, he said, "In the graveyard." "A little bit louder, please. Don't be afraid. You were in the graveyard." A horrible smile flitted across Outlaw Joe's face. "Were you anywhere near Horse William's grave?" "Yes, sir." "Speak up. Just a trifle louder. How near were you?" "Near as I am to you." "Were you hidden or not?" "I was hid." "Where?" "Behind the elms on the edge of the grave." Outlaw Joe gave a start. "Anyone with you?" "Yes, sir. I went there with—" Wait a moment. Never mind mentioning your companion's name. We will produce him at the proper time. Did you carry anything there with you?" Tom hesitated and looked confused. "Speak out, boy. What did you take there?" "Only a dead rat." There was a ripple of laughter. "We will produce the skeleton of that rat. Now, my boy, tell us everything that occurred. Tell it your own way. Don't skip anything. Don't be afraid." Tom began. He hesitated at first, but as he warmed up, his words flowed more and more easily. In a little while, every sound in the courtroom ceased but his own voice. Every eye fixed itself upon him. With parted lips, the audience hung upon words, taking no note of time. They were all caught up in the ghastly tale. The strain reached its climax when the boy said, "And as the doctor fetched the board around and Muff Potter fell, Outlaw Joe jumped at him and—" Crash! All heads turned toward the corner of the courtroom where Outlaw Joe had been sitting. Quick as lightning, the outlaw sprang for a window, tore his way through the crowd, and was gone. Tom was a glittering hero, the pet of the old, the envy of the young. His name even went into immortal print, for the village paper had a story about him the next day. There were some who believed he would be president if he escaped hanging. Tom's days were days of splendor, but his nights were seasons of horror. Outlaw Joe invaded all his dreams, always with doom in his eye. Hardly any temptation could persuade the boy to go out after nightfall. Poor Huck was in the same state of wretchedness and terror. Huck was afraid that Muff Potter's lawyer would tell what he knew. Tom had told the whole story to the lawyer the night before the last day of the trial. Huck was sorely afraid that his share in the business might leak out yet. The lawyer had promised secrecy, but Huck was sure he wasn't sure he could be trusted. After all, Tom had broken their solemn oath, and the attorney might too. Muff Potter's gratitude made Tom glad he had spoken. But at night, Tom wished he had sealed his tongue. Half the time he was afraid Outlaw Joe would never be captured. During the other half, Tom was afraid he would be captured. Rewards for Outlaw Joe were offered, and the country was searched, but no Outlaw Joe was found. A detective came up from St. Louis, snooped around, shook his head, looked wise, and found a clue. But you can't hang a clue for murder. And after the detective had gone home, Tom felt just as insecure as before. The slow days drifted on. And that concludes today's story. So let's review the questions I asked at the beginning. Why did Tom decide to tell his story? Pause the video. Maybe he wanted to save Muff Potter's life. He wanted to do the right thing. He wanted Outlaw Joe to go to prison. Next question. Before Tom told his story, why did it seem the jury would find Muff Potter guilty? Pause the video. Maybe because the evidence was against Muff Potter, Outlaw Joe said Muff Potter had committed the murder. Next question. On the last day of the trial, why didn't Muff Potter's lawyer ask the witnesses any questions? Pause the video. Maybe their testimony didn't matter. He only needed to ask Tom questions. Next question. The story says Tom's days were days of splendor, but his nights were seasons of horror. Why do you think the writer used the word seasons to describe Tom's nights? Pause the video. Maybe to show that his nights seemed to last a long time. Next question. How do you think Huck feels about Tom's decision? Explain your answer. Pause the video. Maybe because he was unhappy with Tom, because Tom broke their oath. He's happy because he knows Tom did the right thing. He's nervous because people might find out he was involved too. All right, let's look at our questions today. You have logic. Write the answer for items 1 and 2. Here's a rule of logic. Just because the writer presents some choices doesn't mean there are no other choices. The following statement by a writer breaks the rule. We have really been lucky with our garden, but this year is different. We're actually too lucky. We planted some corn, and now we have bushels and bushels of corn. There is far more than we can eat. If we just leave the corn in the garden, it will rot. So we must either burn the corn or throw it away. Which 2 choices does the writer present? And name another choice that could be possible. Hint, it's edible. Comprehension. Question 1. Why did Tom decide to tell his story? 2. Before Tom told his story, why did it seem the jury would find Muff Potter guilty? 3. On the last day of the trial, why didn't Muff Potter's lawyer ask the witnesses any questions? 4. The story says Tom's days were days of splendor, but his nights were seasons of horror. Why do you think the writer used the word seasons to describe Tom's thoughts? 5. How do you think Huck feels about Tom's decision? Explain your answer. And your writing prompt today. At the trial, Tom told the story of the murder. Pretend you are Tom Sawyer. Write the story you told during the trial. Try to answer the following questions. Why were you in the graveyard? What did the doctor do? What did Muff Potter do? What did Outlaw Joe do? And when did you leave? Make your story at least 80 words long. And also, don't forget to do your workbook. Take care. Bye.